Greetings, YouTube. Recently, somebody left a comment on one of my RPG videos discussing conditions and the miserable condition that conditions are in. There are a lot of conditions, and that hasn't been fixed in like Pathfinder 2nd Edition or 5th Edition. There are still lots of conditions, but I'm more familiar with Pathfinder 1st Edition. So let's take a look at Pathfinder 1st Edition. I've got this pulled up from the d20pfsrd.com and under the category of game mastering / conditions. We have one here which is called antagonize, but that's third party, so I'm just going to ignore that. We have a condition of bleed. That's a pretty standard condition. I think we can, that's kind of important. We have blinded, broken, confused, cowering, dazed, dazzled, dead, deafened, disabled, dying, energy drained, entangled, exhausted, fascinated, fatigued, flat-footed, frightened, grappled, helpless, incorporeal, invisible, nauseated, panicked, paralyzed, petrified, pinned, prone, shaken, sickened, sinking. Oh, I forgot the sinking one. Sinking is actually, sinking is also, I can throw that probably under, sorry, getting ahead of myself. Stable, staggered, stunned, and then we have a couple of unconscious, then we have asleep and drowsy, which are also third party. We're not going to worry about asleep and drowsy. So the broken and sinking, I think, are items, and let's face it, broken is something that lots of people are going to encounter. You're going to have broken equipment. You're going to find broken equipment, things like that. But sinking, that's a real corner case. You know, you're not going to be in many situations where you are sinking. So I think we can ignore sinking for the most part. And broken is an item condition, so we're not going to have to worry about that much at all. I don't think either, as far as conditions of the person is concerned, the player characters and the non-player characters. So what I'm suggesting here is that maybe we should fold in some of these into a fewer number of them. So there are ones I'm going to want to keep, like bleed. Bleed's a very specific kind of damage type, and I think that's kind of important. I think it's just as important to say as, like, fire damage or cold damage, things like that. Bleed is a type of damage that can be detrimental to someone over time. So I think bleed should pretty much be a condition that remains on as is. Though how you want to interpret bleed is up to you. You could just say it's a bleed and the person is going to take one point every round, or you want to have it conditions like bleed 1, bleed 2, specifying how severe the bleeding is that the person is experiencing. Again, I said broken. I think broken we need because items are going to be found that way and be shoved into that category if somebody tries to sunder your weapon. But here's an example. Let's just say we're going to have a category called dazed. Now, dazed is going to be covering everything essentially that can rattle your mental faculties. So confused, cowering, dazed, fascinated, frightened, panicked, and shaken all fall into that category. Now, you could collapse that even further, say into like 5 if you wanted, and put them in some kind of an order and say that each level is an impairment. And then you could even go so far as to say that you may have a certain level of immunity based on your con bonus, or you recover more quickly because of your con bonus or something like that if you wanted to. But design it so that all of those other things are no longer standalone conditions. They all are conditions that are rattling your mental faculties. Then we have dazzled, which is a visual thing. And then inside that, I would put blinded. So dazzled would be a lesser version of blinded, while blinded would be the full-blown kind of blind. And you could probably break that down to like a -2 to -4, something like that, to your actions, designated that you have a difficult seeing because your eyes are like, oh, it's just too bright out here. Kind of like I do when I walk outside after having been inside all night long at work. We have deafened. Now, deafened is a very specific. I don't think you can actually put that into anything else. maybe you could squeeze it into dazzled. I'm not sure, but being deaf is definitely something I think you may want to leave on its own. But I'm open to argument on that one. Um, then we have the category of disabled. Now, disabled is going to be disabled, and then within it would be dying, dead, and of course stable, which is uh, the opposite of disabled, essentially. Um, so again, different degrees. Obviously dead, the person is longer with us. Dying, you're in the process of dying. Disabled, you are you are deeply impaired. You're not quite dying yet, but you're at 0 hit points. You're on the cusp of dying. You're incapable of doing almost anything. And stable is that you're say you're 0 hit points, but you're not quite you're in a condition that you're not going to get worse. Whereas if you've been disabled, you're very likely you're going to slip into the dying state very rapidly unless somebody does something to stop that. It also could mean that when you're dying and unconscious, stabilization halts the process. You will no longer get any closer to dead, but you don't necessarily get any closer to being awake either. Um, Energy drain deals with the number of negative levels you have. That's kind of specific, so I think I would leave energy drain alone. Flat-footed, that's all about being surprised. I think that kind of should be left alone as well. Then we have grappled and pinned, and I think that pinned should be rolled into grappled, pinned being a more advanced version of grappled. Essentially, you're been almost completely immobilized at that point because the grapple was very successful, stealing that from actual wrestling there. Then we have the helpless category. Now, the helpless category is going to be all about the physical impairments as opposed to daze, which is your mental faculties. Helpless is going to start dealing with the things that affect your body. And for example, helpless, paralyzed, petrified, staggered, stunned, and unconscious. And I think we could just put sleep under unconscious as well, though you might be able to have it, a person who is asleep may get a much better chance of rolling to become aware of their surroundings than someone who is unconscious. Because being asleep is much different than being rendered unconscious because of illness or because of injury. Um, though I have been told I sleep very deeply, and you can, and under certain circumstances, pretty much nothing wakes me up. And I would see helpless, paralyzed, and petrified as being in direct line. Boom, boom, boom. Staggered and stunned, maybe lesser versions, maybe in front of helpless, maybe in front of paralyzed. Again, that would be an interpretation of how the GM wanted to do it. But again, you're kind of folding in these things into one category and just kind of like talking about degrees. And I think that makes it a little more reasonable when it comes to the number of conditions we've got. Then we have incorporeal, and invisible. Now, these are conditions that they're conditions that you want. You are seeking out the ability to become incorporeal or invisible. It is very rare where someone is forced into being incorporeal or invisible, though forcing an enemy into the state of incorporeal or incorporeality, I think that's a word, I'm not positive, is an interesting combat mechanism because the person could now affect things in the ethereal realm if your campaign has an ethereal realm, but they can't interact with the world around them. So the player characters could very well think their companion has been teleported away or disintegrated or something, when in fact they're in the room with them. They just cannot communicate any longer, and they are invisible and they cannot touch. So that could be an extremely challenging process for someone like guys, can't you see me kind of thing. But of course they can't because you're essentially a ghost at that point. Then we have prone, and prone is both a negative and a positive. There are times when you want to be prone, and there are times when you don't want to be prone. So I think that should be a category that stays on its own. Then we have stunned. Now, stunned is, again, it's a category, it kind of falls in very similar to helpless, but the stunned is a little bit less severe in some ways. For actually, stunned is entangled, though I would say that entangled could be rolled into grappled if you want to have it, say, entangled, grappled, pinned. That would be reasonable. Exhausted, fatigued, nauseated, and sickened. You are physically impaired, but not to the degree as if you are being paralyzed or you're staggered or uh, uh, or petrified. Now, I realize that I said stunned in two different places because there's two different ways of looking at stunned. You could put stunned under helpless, or you could make stunned its own category and had within stunned these other things that are all folded in. That's kind of the way I did it, but I put it in two places because there is an argument, I think, to be said that it could go into either way. It could be it's something as part of something else, or it could be a standalone thing and other things folded into it. Even having done this, there's still quite a few conditions under Pathfinder First Edition. PF1's got a bunch. I mean, so did 3.5. So, I mean, again, PF1 is an outgrowth of 3.5. But having looked at PF1 and the people at the, Paizo deciding that we need to reinvent our system so that we can make more money and we can fix the problems that PF1 had, I don't think they succeeded because there's still a lot of conditions in PF2, as there are still a lot of conditions under 5th edition. So I think they could have done something similar to this by folding things in, or just flat out just done away with a bunch of stuff and just put this category, and this category covers these things. And you can have this a flat ability amount of impairment, or you can have set up so there's a degrees of impairment. I've been looking at a lot of powers that have degrees. I've currently been reading a lot of Mutants and Mastermind and DC Adventures, which is an outgrowth of Mutants and Mastermind. And they very much have a lot of degrees of abilities because it's all geometric. So it's like a level 1 and level 2 is twice as powerful as level 1. 3 is twice as powerful. So the different levels are important to the different power levels of the game. And in the same way here, you could be looking at the same with these conditions. So yeah, I know I've said the word condition a lot. I've waxed poetic here quite a bit about this topic. But I think that we can fold in conditions to a bit to try to whittle things down to a more reasonable number. And again, some of these, you're just never going to encounter them when it comes to your player character, like broken and sinking. You are not broken or sinking. Your equipment is broken and sinking. So that's not a category you're never going to have to worry about. And incorporeal and invisible, again, while they are technically conditions, they're things that you want to be. You go out of your way to acquire them. And like prone, that's one of those, sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. It depends on the situation you're in. So while they're on my list I've got here, if we could take those out, and that would, right there, that would get like 4 items off this list, so the list gets even smaller. So let's talk about conditions. How many conditions do you think a high fantasy game needs to cover the bases, but not have so many things covered that you're trying to juggle 12 balls all at once in the air? That's just not how it's done. You can't do that all the time, particularly if you're a GM, man. I know that there are people out there who have done the poker chip mechanism where they have conditions represented by poker chips, and then you put a poker chip underneath a miniature on the board to represent the conditions that figure is experiencing. And when the condition ends, you take the poker chip out, and now it's a simple visual cue. But there aren't enough colors of poker chips to cover even my collapsed definition of what is, a more reasonable list. So you really have to have things broken down even further, much more, even a coarser degree of granularity if you're going to use that kind of a method. And that's also grown out of miniatures, combat themselves, people using wargaming. That's not a new concept that we came up with. Wargamers have been doing that kind of thing for a long time. I've just seen it used at the table by other folks for that purpose, trying to keep a thumb on conditions. And there are products out there you can buy where you can have condition cards, so you can help organize your conditions. And again, if you're a GM, that's a nightmare, man. That's one of the reasons I've implemented the whole one hit and 2 hit mooks. Don't want to juggle conditions on 1 and 2 hit mooks. Just they're out of action or they're in the action. They've been hit once and they're down, or they've been hit twice and they're down. Done. Move on. And then you start getting into like the sergeants and the captains and the big bad, and now you have people who've got actual stats. Um, so let's talk about conditions, how many you think the game needs, and how you have grappled with the improvements in PF2 and 5th edition, and do you think that they've achieved any of their goals, which is to make things theoretically simpler?